Some people move to a lake house to get away from it all, find some peace, maybe watch the sunrise shimmer across the water with a cup of coffee in hand. That's exactly what I had in mind when I bought my little slice of heaven 3 years ago. A modest home on the edge of a crystal-clear lake with a dock I had built myself. I poured time, sweat, and money into that dock. It wasn't just wood and nails to me, it was my sanctuary, a place where I'd fish in the mornings, read in the afternoons, and sometimes sip whiskey while the stars danced overhead. It was private property, and every neighbor knew it. Every neighbor except Karen. Now, let me be clear. When I say Karen, I'm not just using the internet nickname. Her actual name is Karen, and she also happens to be the president of our HOA. If you've ever lived under the rule of an HOA, you know the type. Clipboard in hand, eyes squinting at your flower beds, ready to pounce on any perceived violation. We'd had our share of minor skirmishes over the years, but nothing that prepared me for what was coming. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my world tilted. I woke up, stretched, poured my coffee, and looked out the window, and froze. My dock was covered in white chairs, floral arrangements, and a small archway festooned with gauzy fabric. People bustled about, setting up what was clearly a wedding. On my dock, without so much as a phone call, a text, or a knock on my door. At that moment, one thing became clear. If Karen thought she could just hijack my dock for her daughter's dream wedding, she was in for a surprise, and I was about to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. When I first laid eyes on this property, I knew it was meant to be mine. Nestled on the quieter side of the lake, away from the clustered vacation rentals and weekend party crowds, it offered something that had become rare: solitude. The house itself was nothing fancy. A 2-bedroom cabin with creaky floorboards and a stubborn front door that always needed an extra tug. But the land, oh, the land was beautiful. Towering pines framed the backyard, and a gentle slope led right down to the water's edge. There, jutting out over the calm surface of the lake, was my dock, or rather, what used to be an old, rotting skeleton of one. When I moved in, it was barely usable. Half the boards were warped, the supports wobbled, and the entire structure leaned precariously to one side. It became my first big project. Every spare weekend, I was out there tearing down the old and building the new. I reinforced it with treated lumber, added wide planks perfect for lounging or casting a line, and even installed cleats for tying up the small fishing boat I'd saved for. The crowning touch was a pair of Adirondack chairs at the far end, where I could sit and feel as though the lake belonged to me alone. That dock wasn't just functional, it was personal. I had spent countless evenings watching fireflies blink to life over the water, sometimes with friends, often in quiet contemplation. It was a space of peace and restoration, and while neighbors often admired the work I'd done, they also knew to respect it. The dock was private property, marked clearly by posted signs. I wasn't the kind of person to be territorial for the sake of it, but I valued boundaries, and I expected others to do the same. Unfortunately, not everyone shared that respect. Our HOA, with its endless list of petty regulations and constant power plays, had always been more of a nuisance than a true community force. And at the heart of it all was Karen, eager to enforce every rule on others while bending them for herself. Little did I know, she had set her sights on my dock for something far bigger than a neighborhood barbecue. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the kind of person who seemed born to wield authority, no matter how trivial. When I first moved in, she arrived at my door with a welcome basket in one hand and a printed copy of the HOA bylaws in the other. The smile she wore barely masked the steely glint in her eyes. I remember thanking her politely, only to have her immediately point out that my mailbox was an inch too tall, according to Section 4, Paragraph B of the Community Guidelines. That was our very first conversation. From that moment on, I knew Karen wasn't interested in neighborly warmth. She was interested in control. Over the years, she made it her mission to micromanage every detail of life on our street. If your lawn grew an inch too long, you'd get a notice. If you put out your trash can a few hours too early, expect a sternly worded email. I once received a letter because a guest's car had one tire slightly over the edge of my driveway. The kicker? That same week, Karen had hosted a noisy garden party that ran late into the night, her guests parking haphazardly all over the cul-de-sac. But rules, it seemed, didn't apply to her. Karen was the undisputed queen of the HOA board, having stacked it with her closest friends. Meetings were less about genuine community concerns and more about her personal vendettas. And while many residents privately complained, few dared challenge her openly. She was relentless, with a knack for turning even minor disputes into prolonged dramas. The more resistance she met, the harder she pushed. I'd largely kept my distance, preferring not to engage unless absolutely necessary. But that didn't stop Karen from occasionally trying to pull me into her web. She had once suggested that I landscape the path down to my dock for the good of the neighborhood's appearance. I declined. Another time, she asked if I would allow the HOA to use my dock for the community's 4th of July event. Again, I declined. That particular refusal had earned me a thinly veiled threat about reviewing my compliance with outdoor lighting regulations. Through it all, I remained polite but firm. I valued my privacy and I valued my property. And while Karen no doubt saw me as a stubborn obstacle, I saw her as a minor irritation until the day she crossed a line so brazen it defied belief. That wedding on my dock wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was Karen's latest and boldest power move. I hadn't yet grasped just how entitled she felt, but I was about to find out. And this time, I wasn't going to sit back and take it. The week leading up to the wedding was unusually quiet. The lake shimmered beneath cloudless skies, and the air carried that warm, lazy hum of summer. I spent most afternoons on the dock, either with a book in hand or casting a line, grateful for the calm. Karen had been uncharacteristically absent, which I took as a small blessing. I hadn't seen her making her usual rounds with that ever-present clipboard. It was almost enough to put me at ease. Almost. 2 days before the incident, I noticed a pair of unfamiliar men walking near the lake's edge. They were studying the shoreline, pointing at the water, then glancing up toward my property. When I approached to ask if they needed something, they simply nodded politely and moved on without explanation. I thought it odd, but assumed they might be contractors or tourists scoping out rental properties. The thought that they could be connected to Karen didn't cross my mind, yet. Then came the morning before the wedding. I was out front watering the flower beds when Karen strolled by, a wide grin plastered across her face. She paused to chat, her tone syrupy sweet, complimenting my roses and asking about my weekend plans. I should have sensed something in her exaggerated cheeriness, but I dismissed it. Perhaps she was turning over a new leaf. In hindsight, I realized she was simply making sure I wouldn't be on the dock the following day. Looking back, the signs were all there. The strange visitors, the uncharacteristic pleasantries, the vague way Karen had asked if I would be heading out of town soon. I chalked it all up to coincidence. It wasn't until the next morning that I understood just how calculated it had been. The sun rose bright and early that Saturday, its golden light pouring through my bedroom window. I padded into the kitchen, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and shuffled toward the sliding glass door that overlooked the lake. My eyes were still bleary when I pulled the curtains aside, expecting the familiar, tranquil view that greeted me each morning. Instead, my jaw nearly hit the floor. My dock, my private dock, was transformed. Rows of white folding chairs lined either side of a makeshift aisle, leading up to an arch draped in sheer fabric and festooned with flowers. Along the edges of the dock, vases of baby's breath and lavender swayed in the breeze. A small sound system sat precariously near the water's edge, cables snaking back toward a portable generator parked awkwardly on the grass. Several people bustled about, hanging signs, arranging chairs, and testing microphones. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was hallucinating. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. No, this wasn't a dream. It was a full-blown wedding setup on my dock. Stunned, I slid open the door and stepped out onto my deck, trying to process what I was seeing. The breeze carried snippets of conversation from the lakeshore. I caught phrases like, "The bride will love this," and "perfect spot for the photos." As I stood there, frozen, Karen appeared at the head of the path leading down to my dock. She wore a pastel dress and a wide-brimmed hat, her clipboard conspicuously absent for once. When she spotted me, her smile widened as if we were old friends sharing a private joke. I marched down toward her, heart pounding. "Karen," I began, struggling to keep my voice even. "What on earth is going on?" She glanced at the flurry of activity behind her and responded with an airy wave of her hand. "Oh, it's my daughter's wedding. Isn't it lovely? The lake makes such a beautiful backdrop." I stared at her in disbelief. "On my dock? Without asking? Without permission?" Karen tilted her head, the smile never leaving her face. "Well, you weren't using it today, and the community deserves to enjoy these beautiful spaces, don't you think? Besides, it's just for a few hours." I could hardly believe the audacity. My dock wasn't a public park. It wasn't HOA property. It was mine, clearly marked and documented. Yet here stood Karen, as if commandeering it for a private event was the most natural thing in the world. Before I could fire back, a young man in a suit approached her, clipboard in hand. "We're ready for the rehearsal run," he said. Karen gave me a final, condescending smile. "It'll all be over by sunset. You won't even know we were here." As she turned and sauntered toward the arch, rage boiled beneath my skin. I knew then and there that I wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. If Karen thought she could hijack my property without consequence, she was about to receive a very public lesson in respect. I headed back to my house, mind already spinning with possibilities. Today, the lake would bear witness to more than just wedding vows. It would witness karma in action. Once I got back inside, the initial shock gave way to a focused clarity. I knew better than to confront Karen in front of a crowd or try to reason with her mid-spectacle. That would only give her a stage and an audience, exactly what she thrived on. Instead, I grabbed my phone and walked to the second-floor window that overlooked the dock. I hit record. I zoomed in slowly, capturing every detail: the decorations, the chairs, the wedding planner barking directions, the catering team setting up a long buffet table dangerously close to the edge. I recorded the extension cords, the electrical equipment, the signs bearing the couple's names, all situated on my private dock. I made sure to pan out, showing the posted sign at the entrance of the dock that read, "Private property, no trespassing." That sign had been there for years, nailed in place by my own hand. It wasn't new, it wasn't hidden, and now it would be part of the record. Next, I pulled up the original property layout on my computer. Sure enough, the dock was within the survey lines, solidly on my parcel. I snapped a photo of the surveyor's report, then emailed it to myself along with the video file, just in case. I wasn't going to rely on just righteous anger. I wanted facts, proof, timestamps. As I worked, my phone buzzed. A neighbor down the street sent a photo of the wedding setup with a text, "Karen's throwing a wedding on your dock?" Others followed, expressing disbelief, asking if I'd agreed to it. I didn't respond yet. I was building my case. I didn't know exactly what I'd do with all this information, but one thing was clear. Karen had trespassed, and I wasn't about to let her sail away from this scot-free. From my living room window, I watched as the wedding unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Guests began arriving in clusters, women in flowing dresses and men in crisp suits, their voices carrying up the hill in a cheerful hum. The dock groaned slightly under the weight of so many unfamiliar feet, but no one seemed to notice or care. A string quartet began tuning their instruments at the far end near the archway. The once quiet lakeshore was now alive with activity. I stayed inside, phone still in hand, capturing snippets of video when I could. The whole scene was surreal, like watching a movie in which the lead character had somehow been replaced by a villain you knew all too well. Karen flitted about, directing traffic with exaggerated gestures, greeting each guest like royalty. She beamed with pride, soaking in compliments about the stunning lakefront venue. Not once did she glance toward my house, but I knew she was aware of my presence. The bride soon appeared, a vision in white, her dress billowing in the breeze. The bridal party lined up neatly on the dock, photographers snapping away, guests took their seats, murmurs dying down as the officiant stepped forward. A hush settled over the crowd. Through it all, I remained stone-faced, watching, recording, calculating. There was no point in storming down there now. Doing so would only ruin the bride's day, and she likely had no idea about the underhanded scheme that had secured her wedding venue. My issue wasn't with her, it was with the smug woman orchestrating it all. As the ceremony began, I found myself pacing. Each polite vow and tearful smile was another needle in my side. My sanctuary had been transformed into someone else's stage without permission, without respect. And yet, amid the rising tide of indignation, A plan was already forming in the back of my mind. I wasn't going to interrupt the ceremony. No, I would wait. I would let the celebration proceed exactly as Karen intended, and when the moment was right, I would remind her, loud and clear, whose dock this truly was. As the officiant's voice drifted across the water, I sat at my kitchen table, fingers tapping a restless rhythm. Rage simmered beneath the surface, but I knew better than to act impulsively. Karen had orchestrated this spectacle with the assumption that I would either cave or stay silent. I intended to do neither. What I needed was a response that would make a point, not just for today, but for every smug HOA meeting to come. That's when my gaze fell upon an old set of tools hanging on the wall. A memory surfaced. When I'd rebuilt the dock, I had designed it to be semi-modular. The floating section at the end was tethered to the main frame with quick-release cleats and reinforced ropes. It was intentional. I wanted the flexibility to detach it for repairs or storage during storms. The setup had worked flawlessly for years. Now it offered an opportunity I hadn't considered until that very moment. The idea took hold like wildfire. I pictured it clearly, the wedding in full swing, the bride and groom mid-photo session, Karen basking in praise, and then, slowly, subtly, the dock beginning to drift. No confrontation, no yelling, just a gentle reminder that private property comes with boundaries and consequences. Excitement replaced anger. I grabbed my phone again, reviewed the footage I had already captured, and added a few more shots to complete the sequence. If this ended up in court or the HOA boardroom, I wanted the full story documented. Then, I slipped out the side door, keeping to the shadows of the trees. I approached the shoreline unnoticed, heart pounding not with nerves, but with delicious anticipation. Timing was everything. I wouldn't act while the vows were being exchanged or during any sacred moments. But once the party moved into the celebration phase, once the wine began to flow and attention wavered, that's when the real fun would begin. Standing by the water's edge, I smiled to myself. The dock that had given me so much peace was about to deliver a message Karen would never forget. All I had to do now was wait. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lake. From my vantage point behind a cluster of trees, I watched as the wedding shifted from solemn vows to jubilant celebration. The guests mingled freely now, champagne flutes in hand, laughter and chatter filling the air. The bride and groom posed beneath the floral arch while photographers darted about, capturing every moment. Music drifted from the speakers, blending with the soft lapping of water against the dock. It was the perfect moment. I slipped closer, moving silently along the narrow path that led to the dock's foundation. The main section of the dock was fixed in place, but the floating end, the beautifully decorated stage for today's festivities, was held fast by two heavy ropes looped through stainless steel cleats. I had tied those knots myself, designed for strength but easy to release when needed, and now they would serve a new purpose. Crouching low, I inspected the nearest rope. No one seemed to notice me. Their attention was fixed on the newlyweds as they danced to their first song. I took a deep breath, fingers working quickly yet deliberately. The first knot loosened with a practiced tug. I coiled the rope neatly, setting it aside to avoid suspicion. One down. Moving to the second cleat, I repeated the process. My heart raced with a mix of adrenaline and giddy satisfaction. This wasn't about malice. It was about justice, about restoring the boundary that Karen had so brazenly crossed. The final knot slipped free beneath my fingers. I gave the rope a gentle pull, ensuring it wouldn't snag. Then, with one subtle push against the floating section, I set the plan in motion. At first, nothing happened. The dock remained still, buoyed by inertia and the weight of its passengers. But the lake wasn't perfectly calm. A light breeze whispered across the water, catching the edge of the platform. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to drift. An inch, then two, then more. From where I stood, it was a mesmerizing sight. The guests remained blissfully unaware, too caught up in conversation and celebration to notice the subtle shift. Chairs tilted ever so slightly. Decorations fluttered as the dock eased farther from shore. It wasn't long before someone shouted, a note of alarm piercing the merriment. Heads turned. Cameras swung around. The realization spread like wildfire. "The dock! It's moving!" Chaos erupted. Guests stumbled toward the edges, some leaping back to solid ground while others clung to the drifting platform. The bride shrieked, the groom cursed. And through it all, Karen's voice rose above the din, shrill and commanding. "Stop it! Somebody stop it! Bring it back!" I watched from the shadows, a quiet smile on my lips. The lake had delivered its verdict, my dock was reclaiming its freedom, and Karen, oh Karen, had finally learned that entitlement only floats so far. The aftermath was pure pandemonium. Guests milled about in confusion, some soaked from hasty jumps into the shallows, others shouting across the growing gap between the floating dock and the shoreline. The quartet's instruments were hastily packed away as the musicians scrambled to safer ground. The photographer, bless him, continued snapping pictures of the mayhem, perhaps sensing the viral potential of what was unfolding. Karen was in the center of it all, barking orders with a fury I had never witnessed before. Her carefully curated facade had crumbled. Gone was the charming hostess. In her place stood a red-faced woman demanding the impossible. She screamed for the dock to be pulled back, for someone, anyone, to take responsibility. I half expected her to demand the lake itself reverse course. Eventually, Lake Patrol arrived after someone had the good sense to call them. I remained on my property, sipping a fresh cup of coffee on my deck as the patrol boat corralled the wayward dock and guided it back towards shore. The officers spoke with Karen at length, though from their expressions, it was clear they weren't sympathetic. One officer later approached my property line, requesting a word. I met him halfway, presenting my video evidence, property deed, and photos with calm, deliberate clarity. He reviewed everything, nodded, and thanked me for my cooperation. "Looks like you were well within your rights," he said quietly. I simply smiled. Word of the incident spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the entire community was buzzing. Texts and emails flooded my phone, many from neighbors who had long chafed under Karen's iron grip. They offered congratulations, laughter, and no small amount of admiration. A few even confessed they wished they'd thought of it themselves. The crowning moment came 2 days later when an emergency HOA meeting was convened. Karen, looking far less composed, attempted to spin the narrative in her favor, but with video evidence circulating and public sentiment firmly against her, her words rang hollow. For the first time since I'd moved to the lake, Karen no longer held the room. The queen of the HOA had been dethroned, and I hadn't even had to raise my voice. In the days that followed, it became clear that the tide of public opinion had shifted dramatically. Karen's stranglehold on the neighborhood had loosened, not through any grand speech or legal battle, but through the simple, undeniable spectacle that had unfolded on the lake. Neighbors, who had once tiptoed around her or quietly endured her tyranny, now found their voices. It started with a few casual conversations. On my morning walks, fellow residents stopped me with knowing smiles and a pat on the back. Some laughed openly, recounting the scene of guests scrambling and Karen shouting helplessly from the shore. Others expressed genuine gratitude, saying they had long wished someone would stand up to her. The video clips that had been discreetly shared among the community only fueled the fire. Each frame of the drifting dock served as a perfect metaphor for Karen's waning influence. The next HOA meeting was packed, standing room only. For the first time, voices rose in opposition to Karen's usual directives. Members questioned her leadership, her decisions, and most pointedly, her unauthorized use of private property. She attempted to deflect, to paint herself as the victim of an unkind prank, but the room wasn't buying it. The evidence was too clear, the audacity too great. By the end of the evening, a motion was raised to conduct a formal review of Karen's role as HOA president. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive enough to send a message. Karen's reign of unchecked entitlement was over. Through it all, I kept my commentary to a minimum. The lake had spoken louder than I ever could. My dock was once again secure, its boundaries respected, and Karen, she would think twice before crossing them, or me, again. In the weeks that followed, life on the lake gradually returned to its peaceful rhythm. The early mornings were once again mine alone, with the sun rising quietly over still waters. The dock, now fully secured with reinforced tethers and a new locking mechanism, stood as a silent reminder of what had transpired. I spent more time than usual sitting out there, watching the play of light on the ripples, reflecting on the strange series of events that had unfolded. I thought a lot about boundaries, not just the physical ones marked by property lines, but the personal ones we all have, the ones that demand respect. For years, Karen had operated under the assumption that her position entitled her to disregard those boundaries. She mistook silence for weakness, assuming that no one would dare push back. But entitlement has a way of eroding goodwill, of slowly building a wall of resentment, brick by brick. That wedding was simply the final brick in a wall that had been growing for a long time. I didn't relish the chaos that day had caused. The bride and groom, after all, were likely unaware of the trespass that facilitated their picture-perfect venue. But sometimes the only way to make a point is through action, not words. I had defended my property, my peace, and my right to decide how my space was used. And in doing so, I had also reminded the entire community that no one, no matter how loud or insistent, stands above the rules we all live by. Karen has since retreated somewhat from public life, her influence diminished. I still see her occasionally, walking the neighborhood with a far less confident stride. We exchange polite nods, nothing more. The message had been delivered, the lesson had been learned. As for my dock, it remains a place of quiet joy, a sanctuary. And if anyone ever again dreams of commandeering it for their own purposes, they'd do well to remember one thing. The lake has a long memory, and so do I. From now on, my dock is strictly invitation only.